All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another Holochain ecosystem session. It's the 27th of October, 2020, and today we have Sid from Sacred Capital with us.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this, David.
Oh, thanks for being here. We're just laughing that we usually see each other. A lot of the Holochain meetings are aligned with US time. So I was saying, Sid, you look so different today, but I think we've established it. I never see Sid in his morning or afternoon. It's only late at night,
Yeah,
usually like 1 a.m.
yeah. It's shocking to know that I'm actually a decent human being at a reasonable hour.
Well, really glad to have you here today. I know we first must have spoken about like blockchain,
Couple years
holochain,
ago.
legally stuff a couple of years ago. Yeah,
Yeah, it's been a long time.
it's
It's
been a
been a
long time.
testing time.
It has. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sorry, you cut out. I think you muted yourself.
I muted myself as I was asking a question. Look, we'll jump into that a little bit. So tell us a little bit about Sacred Capital,
Mm,
what it is and how it works.
mm. So I think there's a very like tangible elevator pitch version of it, and then there's the meta. Like Sid can go on for hours about it. So I'll start with the with the elevator version, and then we can unpack it as we go. But Sacred Capital is building economic infrastructure for distributed networks. And we think it's radically different from anything we've seen before or the way centralized economies work, because distributed networks obviously don't have the benefits of overarching consensus or any kind of overarching legal system. And so as you engage with people and organize in distributed networks and distributed communities, reputation currencies play a really important role. And so you could say Sacred Capital is building a set of tools, libraries, languages, which activate reputation currencies. And so in the long run, our hope is to build a more multi-dimensional wealth system, whatever that means. But you get the gist. That's what we are. Um,
Okay, super. So tell me a little bit about like what you believe about the world that makes what you're doing
mm,
so important. And I know you touched on it a little bit with
mm,
your belief that we'll be evolving towards distributed networks.
mm. So for me, my background is in finance. I was an equity derivatives and algo trader for a long time, and then spent in time in a community founded by Gandhi, which is off the grid, which was my exposure to distributed economics. For me, I tend to look at everything through the lens of wealth or money, and what I found, or what's been, grating against me for the last decade or so, is that our current economic system was probably the product of the Industrial Revolution, evolved, I don't know, 100 or a couple hundred years ago. And so I think there's two issues with it. Number one, it was designed keeping in mind needs of humans from 100 years ago. And I think those needs looked very different. It was, battling hunger, starvation, disease, basic infrastructure. And two, I think it was designed with the technology that was available at the time. And I'm really cheesed that it hasn't been updated since. It's almost like our operating system hasn't really been updated, but we've zoomed ahead and started building all of these apps while still working on DOS. It's like that's the equivalent of it in my head. And so I would love to see an economic system or wealth system that is more reflective of who we are and where we're at. And so obviously that means updating it to what technologies of today offer. And I think that's where Holochain fits in, because I think we distributed ledger technology does change the game. Instead of just one centralized authority articulating and validating things for us, a larger group of people can do it. Um, And so I think that means instead of one monolithic wealth system that we all have to abide by, we can now start contextually validating what is relevant to us. And that is exciting to me, which means that if we start, letting groups of people and communities of people articulate what is important to them, they might introduce new kinds of value that are important to them. Like not everyone may think on the same single dimension of monetary currencies. Like I think value might start, or different kinds of value may be important to different kinds of people. And so I just think of this as important that we let people do it instead of us, all of us, going to the same watering hole, and being forced to comply, you know, to specific pigeonholes, that we have the freedom to start articulating what is important to us. And yeah, that's my, you could say that's my 10-year, 20-year kick in life. Like that's what I'd love to see. And the ups and downs and the efforts continue in that direction.
Super, thank you. And what is it about you that makes
Mm.
this matter so much? Like what yeah, why does this matter so much to you? And then why does it matter so much that you want to go and leave
Mm.
your finance job, move off grid, and then say, hey, I want to dedicate my life to solving this
Mm.
problem?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to answer that. Um, I grew up in the 80s in India. And for those who don't know, I think India is just this radically diverse region in the world. And so my parents came from different parts of India, and I just grew up very naturally speaking four or five, different languages. And so for me, from a very early age, it was understanding how varied and diverse people are. And I think, you know, regions like that do that. Like it exposes you to what I call radical diversity. Um, and we went through this interesting period in India where communalism led to a lot of problems. As an 11-year-old kid, I lived through riots. I could see, that communal approach to things was breaking down. As romantic as that sounds, like people talk about living as communities and in harmony and the beauty of it, and I actually saw people literally burning each other alive, and you could see India pivot hard towards this neoliberal wave that was sweeping across the world. And personally, I was a product of that. Going to business school, jumping into this global capitalist system, which provided solutions at one level, but I think what it also did was enforce this homogenizing template on what was a very radical reality on the ground. Um, and I think in doing that, we lost some extent of our culture, our identity. Um, I feel like, you know, language is a very important aspect of this. Only one language of the five that I spoke was actually of value to me. And so, which is why you see me speaking English pretty decently. And that came at a loss of so much of the other parts of my cultural identity. And so today we see a lot of these conversations around diversity and let's include people. And to me, that conversation is just deeply unsatisfactory if we aren't changing the underlying plumbing or the infrastructure that actually allows for these diverse stories to manifest and amplify. And so I think it's not enough for us to just say diversity means we have people of color on boards. Like I think it means so much more than that. I think it actually means allowing people to express and articulate what is important to contextually what is important to their community. And so I would love to see an economic system that allows that, like a broader spectrum of value, allows communities to um, build economic systems which value their culture and identity. Because I think neoliberalism was the exact opposite of it. I think it eroded our identity to some extent. And so that's where I come at things. I think there's also this part of me as a masculine person living in this society having to conform to this very narrow definition of being validated. And so from my lens, I think it stems from a very narrow definition of wealth. You look at entrepreneurs today, and I've been on this entrepreneurial journey for a couple of years. There's such a narrow definition, right, of what a successful entrepreneur is. Like, you've got to be this tech bro, big swinging energy. Like, you're talking really big. Your ability to fundraise is everything, and that flows down the line and starts influencing the culture of everything we do. And so that really upsets me because my expression as a masculine person might be so varied, and it sucks that I've only got these a handful of pigeonholes in which to find validation in. And so I think there's this pent up human potential over the last 50, 60, 70 years that's just raring to find expression. um, and so, if I were to summarize it, I would say I hope to build economic infrastructure for a more expressive society, so that Sid has so many layers to him, and all of those layers can find manifestation. Not just the part of him that's a good equity derivatives trader, because I feel like that's just 10% of me. There's so many layers that need to find validation. So that's where I come at things. Like, I think our potential is orders of magnitude greater than what we're currently playing at. And that's what I do. That's why I do what I do.
Amazing. Just on a human level,
Mm.
as you're unlocking that potential inside yourself, like how do you go about that practice?
I've I've had an interesting. I don't know if you want to get into this. So nudge me in the direction if I'm straying away too much. But my wife and I had a baby girl last December, so she's 10 months old right now. And for me, just that process. I mean, I don't want to romanticize parenting because I know there's enough people who do it. But for me to actually tap into these levels of intimacy, to actually um, understand that as a man, I can actually be caring, that I can actually be vulnerable, that I can actually um, have these parts of me that are deeply ambitious and deeply intimate, and that they can coexist, has been an extremely healing process over the last 10 months. Like, I always, flip flop between the two, or thought of them as a binary. And so, at a personal level, I feel like I've been through this transformation of sorts where I see that amalgamation, or I actually see that they were never at odds at each other, right? That ambitious entrepreneur side versus that caring father. I think they were always the same. It's just that my mental model was broken, um, and so it's made me step back. And I think over the last 2 years, time spent in the Holochain community, having these conversations, I feel very grateful that I've been had the opportunity to even do that, has made me think about how am I bringing this amalgamated self into Sid the entrepreneur. um, and I think that's the evolution that lies ahead of us. um, that is not just important for us to build that tech, but I think for us to build the tech in accordance to where we are as humans, like it's like a yin and yang. um, and so at a personal level, I'm thinking about this very strongly. How do I hold these supposed polarities when I'm having conversations with funders? How do I hold these polarities when I'm engaging with the team? um, and can Sid be that better amalgamated evolved self in Sacred Capital as well? And that's been very alive for me personally over the last 10 months. I'm not sure if that answered your question or if that's what you were looking for. But yeah, that's been very alive.
Yeah, super. Thank you.
Mm.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it's having a baby is one way of beginning that integration process. So
Yeah, yeah. And I think some of what I've realized is often, at least in my case, the biggest barriers to that side of me of myself was just me, right? Like I didn't think I could give myself the freedom to engage with all of these capacities within me. And I think about it, maybe it is the last 38 years of living in the society that we do, that we kind of have just resign ourselves to this is how we have to be. And so, yeah, I think we have to step into that unlocking of our own potential um, now. And so there's a part of me, while there's like gloom and doom around, and I don't say this publicly, but I guess I am now, but I do think there's a renaissance over the horizon. And I see it coming, at least in some ways. So, yeah.
well, if you're right, then this is recorded and your reputation will grow.
Or I might just end up sounding really silly.
Yeah, well, it's certainly multi-dimensional at the moment.
Yeah.
The perspectives and the lenses and whatever patterns are happening, whichever way you make sense of things. And I guess
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about. It's building economic infrastructure around even what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, that can actually foster, enable these expressive capacities. And so to some extent, I feel like we're inventing languages as we go. Because, 1,000 or a couple thousand years ago, inventing languages wasn't just the tool, but I think that expression had to follow that made those languages relevant. And so I guess we're just and sometimes when I feel like I'm very significant, I like to dumb it down and just remind myself like all we're doing is just building these nuts and bolts and a language at the end of the day, and to not think that building the language is the work itself. I think there's a lot of allied work around that, which is critical as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I do the same thing. I'm like, I'm just a salesperson who thinks meditation is important.
It's hilarious. Yeah. Yeah. But I digress.
Beautiful. So this has been evolving inside you for a period of time, as you described, and then at some stage you came across Holochain. So what happened when you came across Holochain, and yeah, what caused you to stick?
So my Holochain journey actually began way back in 2014, end of 2015, first part of 2015, which was pre-Holochain. I guess there was meta currency. And I remember, I think I was still in the Gandhi ashram, just transitioning out. And I had a conversation with Eric Harris Brown. And it was around what distributed ledgers are really about and what we're going to do here. And I remember this one thought he left me with. He said, "This isn't about making money more efficient," which at that point, Bitcoin and crypto that's how everyone was experiencing this and thinking about this technology. But he said it's about expanding the very definition of wealth, and so we won't think of wealth just as money, but the more expanded version of it, which is what Art and Eric's work has always been about. And so, back then it just sparked this explosion in my head because I could see then, all of these fringe economic experiments I was part of could now start scaling and start architecting societies in ways in which were meaningful. Because I was part of these experiments, which were, I don't know, 20 people, 100 people big, and now you could see, wow, this technology actually, removes that friction. And so Holochain was very, I think it was love at first sight, because it was very clear that there was a shift away from global consensus towards contextual validation. And so I think that shift moves us from the monetarily critical to the contextually relevant, which basically means, we're not optimizing technology so we can transfer $900 million anonymously across the world for 50 cents. Like I think that's what Bitcoin is for. But we're starting to say, hey, we're a network of people, and we think the number of likes that David has added on my blog article is relevant in some way. It's not relevant for likes. It's not relevant in the way that everybody on the network needs to know about it, but it's relevant in the way that maybe this group of 25 people think it's important. And that Sid should be able to port that information as he hops from network to network. Like maybe it's relevant in another group of people. And maybe the relevance has no monetary footprint. Who knows if likes or other aspects like timestamps have any monetary relevance. And so Holochain actually liberates us from that monetary pressure, in my opinion. And so all of reputation done until now always lived in that shadow of the monetary infrastructure, right? So if you went up to a blockchain bro and said reputation, they immediately go to peer-to-peer lending. Um, and or if you go to, if you talk about within the existing context, it's about, the legal system, or, banks' reputation on, AML and KYC. But I think Holochain breaks past that. And so all of a sudden we have this valuable, rich, multidimensional information, and we can choose what we want to do with it. And so I think that's exciting. And so for me, that's exactly where reputation systems need to thrive and be developed, because reputation can start playing and evolving among, with reputation layers itself, and not constantly be posed with the question of, what is the monetary value of this? Because if you try to, record David's likes on Sid's article on an Ethereum network, that might cost you 10 cents. In a Holochain network, it can potentially be free, or, again, a significantly small fraction of those 10 cents. So it lets us make new kinds of deals with this information. So yeah, that's the attraction towards Holochain, I would say.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think in the same context, if you're recording the transaction on the Ethereum network, you're using it's coming from a wallet and going to a wallet. It's all, I guess you could use one of the Ethereum sort of more expressive identifiers, whereas in Holochain, you're actively trying to use your reputation or the activity in one network to support other patterns or other activities in other networks. So one is, I guess it's the same as having a global consensus versus a versus contextualized local activity, one having a platform versus a network of networks. Then my transaction comes either from an identifier, which I really don't want to use in any other context on Ethereum, to one that I'm desperate to use in other contexts. Not all contexts as well, but just some.
Yeah, I think to make this even more tangible, I think timestamps make it really simple and tangible. It's like I could be engaged in a community with you and be generating all of these timestamps. Maybe I showed up at work on time for 5 years, and maybe this community, David's community, has a really simplistic definition of punctuality. It's just timestamps computed, and if you're on time, you're punctual. It's yes or no. It's binary. But what's beautiful about Holochain is like that this data is stored and validated by this community, and because if of the agent centricity of it, I can actually hold that information at my end and take it as I hop from other relevant networks. Maybe if I hop into another network, maybe it's Bear's community. Bear might think there's monetary value to it, and so technically in Bear's community I monetize it. Maybe in some other community I get a job because of it. Maybe in some other community they think they define punctuality differently. Um, and so these are the kinds of things that Holochain allows that just aren't possible in an Ethereum network. Like you're constantly fighting against the grain because you're constantly pushed towards that $900 million anonymous transaction. Like that's what ends up being the goal more often than not. Um, yeah, so that's one of my reasons for Holochain.
Super. Well, can you show us a little bit of what you've been done, either some slides or simulations or a little bit of both,
Yeah,
and talk us through it to
sure.
bring it to life?
Let me share my screen. So I think there's two broad shifts that, in our view, agent centricity is bringing. And this is, I would say, it's controversial because I think agent centricity is such a wild roller coaster ride that you can pretty much develop your own interpretation of it, right? And so I think a sign of evolution is diversity, and I think Holochain has now evolved to that place where people, you start seeing different interpretations of agent centricity and different approaches towards things. And so within Holochain, you'll find there's a group of people who align with the modularity way of thinking, which is super exciting for me because I think agent centricity is taking us towards a Lego block approach. So if I was to create a Facebook in the centralized tech paradigm, I would have to build everything from the identity layer to the data layer to the AI layer, like all of it, like the entire stack. And so you have these various very fat silo-like stacks that are quite monolithic. But in agent centricity, I think we start sharing infrastructure, which means if you're an entrepreneur trying to build some kind of social network, you actually don't have to build that entire stack. You can just be very clever and borrow over what someone else has built. So you can actually borrow reputational infrastructure, REA's monetary infrastructure, someone else's identity infrastructure, and so I think it's changes the way people build on, you know, build applications and networks, which is super exciting. And I think that meta shift is we might be moving towards neighborhoods as an organizing principle, but I don't know. We can get into that if we have some time later. But to summarize it, I would say is what we're building is the central piece of what we're building is known as the reputation vault. And so that's kind of the dashboard for every agent, for every person as they hop from community to community or even engage within the community to navigate and be in control of their reputation data as they're moving from network to network. But more importantly, they can also, as they're about to engage with people, they can also view that person like, who is David? Does he volunteer at his organic farm on Saturdays? Does he also love these kinds of films? And so it unlocks these new kinds of interactions with us. So that's the reputation vault. And then there's these Lego blocks called libraries, and there's an actual what we're developing is a language, like an actual domain specific language for cultural articulation. I'll talk about that as well. So the reputation libraries, I mean, again, think of them as little blocks. Some of them are powered by REA accounting. And so with the Economic Ed Alliance, which has been um, which has been been put together by a few people within Holochain, we've been building these little Lego blocks that can just be plugged in to existing applications or communities. So if you're a so just yesterday we had an interesting chat with Junto, and instead of what they would love to do is let their communities or groups swap out likes for claps, or maybe upvotes and downvotes. And so they don't actually have to design that within their stack. They just pop in and plug our little Lego blocks. And I think that's super important, because if you're looking for that cultural diversity, that's where we need to go, because a Facebook won't let you do that. A Facebook's going to impose its own cultural architecture on you, and their architecture cultural template is, how can we maximize eyeballs? How can we, we don't care if you're watching cat videos or any other content. And so, which is why they'll impose that cultural template on you. So some of these are on our GitHub repo, and so yeah, I would recommend going and checking some of them out. If there's people out there who are passionate about building this, now's a good time to join in. The DSL for cultural articulation is it's kind of like, we want to make it as simple as popping into a spreadsheet and saying, and defining what you think is punctuality or not for your community or neighborhood. So you don't actually have to write big lines of code, but you can actually say, if timestamp less than this, then not punctual, And so the DSL makes it as easy as that. It's that binding glue that makes all of this articulation come alive. And so it could be, you could define punctuality as a binary, it could be a spectrum, it could be a star rating. You could apply all kinds of distribution curves. There's a bunch of animations, but I don't think we'll get into that. Like, it could be, and so distribution curves also let you modulate culture in a more meaningful way. And so Bosby and Michael Hushin are some of the people building this DSL. But that's the dream, like, for it to be that easy. So anyone who's putting together a group, maybe it's David trying to create a group about what does masculinity mean in today's world, and you want to architect and create your little cultural score for your social network. And so for you to actually be able to play with it and iterate it and swap out Lego blocks, that's what's critical. So with these two aspects, what you see is, like, there's all of these reputation currencies being generated, but there's a central issue with this, in that the reputation currency stays locked within an existing app or within an existing neighborhood. And it's really important for David to be able to port those reputation currencies from one app or one silo to another. And that's where the reputation vault comes in, because as you pop into a new community and that community requests reputation data, you actually have agency over how that new community views you. So maybe you want to port reputation from multiple communities, so you actually hold that agency over it. So in this case, neighborhood A is computing your score with reputation data from multiple communities, and that's possible because of the vault. And so in the long run, this connects with my larger vision for reputation to be made scalable. Because one of the problems with reputation has been that it's often restricted to a context. But with agent-centric technologies and with some, consent-driven tech like reputation vaults, you can actually potentially port them to different contexts through what we call mimetic bridges. And I think this is really important, again, in a meta conversation sometime, because one of the criticisms of distributed networks and why distributed, like, the world is literally burning down, we're facing large-scale global calamities, and you're talking about distributed networks. Like, that makes no sense. Like, we actually need, UN-style coordination. And so I actually think the answer to some of these global problems lies in building solutions through mimetic bridges as opposed to consensus. So I think that's an interesting role that the reputation vault plays. So what does that mean? It means reputation starts becoming this really fluid but utilitarian fluid indicator that we can play with. So is David punctual? There's no absolute answer to that. It's a function of what context you're asking that situation in. And I think that's really important, because reputation done outside of this just becomes very meaningless. It's almost like an Uber rating, right? Like, how meaningless some of that is. And so what do we do with scalable reputation? I think it starts letting us move towards neighborhoods like structures, like new organizing principles. So I think in the past, for the last 50 or 70 years, we've had businesses as organizing principles. Like Facebook is an example of generic culture specific tools. Like Facebook will impose its culture on you. But with neighborhoods, you can actually start forming your micro networks and fragmented little pools of people. But each community can actually spin up tools for their purpose. So maybe our community for conversation needs Reddit-like tools and Instagram-like tools. And so we can actually spin out these clones that are contextualized for our use case. So again, that I think that's why modular tech is really important. Um, so I'd say for people who are interested in this, I'd recommend going over to our Git book. There's a bunch of this articulated, and we're also going to be talking about it quite a bit. But what we're also doing is inviting app creators who align with this way, and also, who want to build really slim stacks for them to start playing with this and figuring out how they can benefit and get away with doing really little, is my conversation to them. Um, I don't know if you want to get into this, but there's this interesting conversation around what you can do with scalable reputation. But potentially, if you're a community and you want to broaden the pool of members but are really worried about diluting the culture, you can actually say, okay, I'm a community A, and I think members of community B are actually relevant to me and contextually related. We can actually throw open our reputation score to also include reputation community B members, and so all of a sudden you can expand your pool without diluting culture. And I think that leads to situations or social networks where you're not entering communities as a stranger. Like when I sign up on Telegram today, I show up as a stranger, like a blank slate. And that's really silly because I might have spoken with David on WhatsApp or on Facebook and on Twitter, but I can't port my context with me. And so as a result of that, we're left with Telegram having to use AI to engage me and suggest users and screen me if I'm an idiot. But instead, if I could just port my reputation with me, I show up. It's like I show up at a dinner party, but I'm not a stranger. I know people from the gym and from the office, and I think that's how reality works. So I think it moves that emphasis away from centralized AI to distributed webs of social intelligence. And so there's a whole bunch of modeling that we've put up on how you can play with culture in this way. So let's say you're a community having economic discussions, and you think you need some influence of the value flows community. You can actually merge that in, or mold that in. There's some best practices put up here. There's conversations around, there's examples of how forking can be done. So let's say we're a community of memers, and I would like to fork our conversation for a specific topic, like maybe memes about Asia. um, I in the current in the current setup, I actually get excluded from the original thread, and I think that's ideally, if I'm contributing in a fork of the thread, I should also receive validation in the original thread. And so that's what this kind of bridging also achieves. You can start, I think at a longer term, you can start constructing complex cultures. Like maybe a community wants to articulate who is safe to meet for a cup of coffee. And so maybe if they have like a decent couch surfing reputation, maybe if they have a decent seed sharing or organic farming reputation, like you can actually construct complex cultures based on like much smaller cultural blocks. And so you can actually design reputation to start enabling more intimate activities. And I think that's one of my beefs with the current internet, right? Like it's fantastic for getting a ride share or getting food delivered, but it's awful to be doing anything intimate over the internet. And even though my wife and I met over the internet, I understand the irony there, but but I think there's so much more that could be possible with the internet, but it's just not a good idea right now because there's absolutely no reputational feedback loops that support this. And so this is an example of, right now we're seeing this massive monopoly in the Ubers and the Grabs and the Lyfts of the world because I think their offering is safety. If someone's behaved poorly in Uber, you know that they're going to screen them out. And it's really weird because that means, we keep relying on Uber for delivering that safety more and more. But I actually think with some of our reputational tools, you could see that reversal back to community-based ride sharing. So maybe my little community of Newton and Singapore here has its own little ride share, and maybe in Orchard there's another little ride share network, and they guarantee safety because if there's bad behavior in one, it actually pings and is echoed across networks. So again, I think that dismantles some of our dependence on massive centralized institutions for guiding reputation. And so you can start moving towards more distributed, like fragmented fractals almost, because good behavior in one actually echoes out contextually into dozens or hundreds of others, and vice versa. Like even negative behavior can ripple out in the same way. um, so yeah, people can go check out some of these simulations that we put up, and our intention over the next few months is to host a bunch of hackalongs, maybe even a dev camp, so people can come forward and get their hands dirty and actually start playing with the stuff. And I think it's not all like, oh my god, cultural architecture. No, like it sounds super cool, but I think it's not actually, it doesn't have to be that abstract. I think it's, if you're a simple entrepreneur trying to put together some kind of offering, or if you're someone trying to drive and build a community, it's important for you to learn what shared infrastructure you can use. So it's basically important because you don't have to go out and rebuild your stack, or don't actually have to build a fat stack. You can just borrow and get your MVP going in much smaller time frames and with much lesser effort. So we're at that phase where we would love to tangibly talk about this with people. And so some of our hackalongs in the Asia Pacific time zone have been really helpful in getting this going. But we might be at that phase where we do a more detailed one where it's like a couple day dev camp of sorts. Um, and it's not just us. I think there's people like Junto who are thinking this way, Pospi with REA who's thinking this way. Um, and we all kind of come together and showcase how modularity works for people. So that was a bit of a dump.
No, amazing. Thank you.
Mm.
I would love in a couple of months to go way deeper into some of those simulations. So maybe as a couple of the hackalongs have happened, and whether it's a dev camp and but I think it would be fascinating to go through into some of these mimetic bridges and some of the simulations you've done there in a little more depth. I think you took us through the concept and then into some of the depth, but I think we could really. But I was going to ask some questions. I thought, you know what, let's keep it where we are today.
Yeah.
And then we can jump into that exclusively
so
on another occasion, because I think there's a lot there, and it might help people out there who are sort of getting the concept a little bit, just see it at that detail level and know how know how they might, because I can imagine that going back to two things that you said over the course of the conversation. One, the ability to build a more intimate internet effectively is something that in a different way will touch everybody. And then as we're building this small stack lighter infrastructure, as you say, reputation's pervading every application that we're building in a centralized or a distributed network. So I think like going into some of that depth will really help people as they start to realize, oh, I'm building this app and, oh, I haven't really thought about reputation too much. I haven't really thought, and you're giving them a guardrails to get really a crash course in that thinking without making the mistakes that we all start making. You know, reputation is absolute. All of these, it's not contextual. All of these things that you're supporting us with. So this tooling that supports us psychologically and socially as well as technically, I think it's awesome, Sid.
Yeah. I think the challenge for us, or I would say what's exciting for me over the next few months, is to land this in a very tangible way. So even with entrepreneurs, while they might, resonate with the long-term goal, it needs to make sense today. And so for them to realize, oh yeah, if I use shared infrastructure, it's so much easier for me. And of course, then that then buys you into larger compliant economic language, which means your members can actually benefit so much more in the long run. So that's how we're breaking it down. And so some of our communication as well over the next few months is going to start to get much more tangible, and this is what's in it for you right now, rather than talking about the long-term goals.
Well, on that note, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening and for drawing out these reflections.
I'm looking forward to learning more.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. This was Sid from Sacred Capital, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.